I think we'd all agree that that was a pretty profound performance of that song, a very familiar song. We've heard others sing it. But apparently, Leonard Cohen, when he was alive, k.d. lang was one of the few artists that he gave permission to cover his rendition of that song. And I know k.d. lang has sung it at other big events, but if you just looked out at the context in which she was singing that and the huge, massive space and crowd, now I know part of it had to do with the filming, but there's a sense of intimacy and something very spiritual about her performance of that song, which really touched me. I was kind of looking up information about k.d. lang, and I came across an article that had been written about her, and the writer referred to her as a musician and a soul transformed, which I thought was kind of intriguing. She said, "The woman I met," this is the writer who had interviewed k.d. lang some years ago, "the woman I met in LA was after something more essential and had already been transformed by the search. Clearly, she has traveled a long way in 8 years, and much of that journey has been inside herself." You certainly can't argue the depth of her ability to present that particular piece of music so poignantly. And I thought that it fit in nicely with our Transfiguration Sunday in the sense of this kind of change that happens from within and how that ends up being embodied or reflected in what we do and how others perceive us. In all three passages read to us by Tony this morning, we hear descriptions of 3 encounters with the divine on a mountaintop that leaves the participants visibly changed. This Sunday is identified, as Reverend John said, in the liturgical calendar as Transfiguration Sunday. And this passage from Exodus tells the stories of Moses' 2 trips up the mountain and his transfigurement that is visibly witnessed by those who see him after his descent. It is as if part of the cloud that had enveloped him, the very presence of the divine, clung to him and showed in the radiance of his face, even as he descended the mountain and returned to the Israelites impatiently waiting below. Similarly, Jesus was enveloped in what is described as a light, radiant cloud, and it is said that his appearance changed from the inside out, right before their eyes. Sunlight poured from his face, even his clothes were filled with light. The deep voice that the disciples heard spoke from that radiant cloud and said, "This is my Son." We've often read the translation, "my beloved," but this translation says, "This is my Son, marked by my love." I'm sure many of us here can say that we have been in love. And that love shone on our faces, at least early on. It literally changed our appearance. We were marked by that love. I remember a friend of mine from my home church who had been widowed for several years who fell in love again with her high school sweetheart. At 75 years of age, we teased her that she looked like a teenager again. She glowed. Love can have that effect on us. It changes us. It transfigures us. The word transfiguration is about change, but it emphasizes more than a dramatic change in appearance. One definition I read described it as making something more beautiful. It is not transformation where you once were one thing and then become something different, like the toys children play with that by twisting and turning and clicking the parts of, say, a car or a truck, it transforms into a robot. Transfiguration is said to be a change that glorifies or exalts someone else. In the case of both Moses and Jesus, their transfiguration, their change in appearance, was directly attributed to the divine that literally seemed to glow or radiate from within them after they had spent time in God's presence. The closest I can remember experiencing this was after my walk on the Camino. It is said that the path of the French way from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port to Santiago is called the Santiago or the Compostela, meaning the way of the stars. And it is believed that many traveled that very route, not just to see the remains of the Apostle James in Santiago, but that particular path or way was in fact infused with some kind of celestial energy that acts like a guide or a path to many travelers. There are some who walk the Camino barefoot because they believe they can literally absorb some of that divine energy as they walk the path that hundreds of thousands have walked before them over the centuries. Now, I most certainly did not walk barefoot, but I have to say that upon my return from walking the Camino, I had more people comment on my appearance. Yes, I had lost some weight, and yes, I was fitter, more toned, but I had a significant number of people comment on my facial appearance, saying things like, "Oh, you just seem to be glowing," or "You're just radiant, something's different, something's beautiful, something good." I remember feeling that even strangers seemed to look at me differently and often smile, and I kept checking to see if there was something stuck on my face, or if my bad hair day really was that bad that people were staring. I wasn't sure if it was because I was just smiling more or what. Call me crazy, but it was a thing. It was noticeable. It didn't last forever. It faded, and my appearance, along with my life, got back to normal after the extraordinary experience of walking the Camino. But something had changed, and something had shifted inside, and people noticed the difference. So much so that, like a moth drawn to a flame, there's a part of me that yearns to experience that again, which I suppose is why so many people walk the Camino more than once. Now, I don't think, though, that you have to walk the Camino to experience this sort of transfiguration or climb a mountain. We do talk about mountaintop experiences quite often, but a spiritual experience is a spiritual experience wherever it happens. This transfiguration is something that can happen by an encounter with the divine, and it does start from the inside and works its way out. Remember that by definition, transfiguration in a spiritual sense is a change in appearance not to glorify ourselves, but rather to glorify or exalt the other, be it God, Creator, source of all being. When Moses descended the mountain after 40 days and 40 nights, and then again the second time, Moses didn't know that the skin of his face glowed because he had been speaking with God. Apparently, Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, saw his radiant face, and they held back. They were afraid to get close to him. It was just so luminous. Moses had to cover his face with a veil because what was exposed was just too bright, too intense for the people to behold. They were in awe of what powerful presence could display such light and radiance. The disciples witnessed a similar change in appearance when Jesus was up the mountain of God, and it was a change that they too said came from the inside out. Sunlight poured from his face, the writers wrote, and his clothes were filled with light. Now, as I said, I don't necessarily believe that we are all called to experience that kind of intense transfiguration, such as Moses and Jesus, but I do believe that when we put ourselves in God's presence, that we too can be changed. And I don't necessarily think that that kind of change can only happen on a mountaintop engulfed in clouds of divine radiance. But I think each of us can make a place or a space in our lives where we open ourselves to the possibility of change that comes from within. And I believe that our Creator is just waiting for the opportunity to make us into something more beautiful than what we are right now. Just waiting to mark us with his love. Next Sunday is the start of Lent, and it is traditionally time for focusing more on God's presence in our lives and kinds of changes that can happen within to ultimately change the way we live our lives. Reverend John and I will be focusing on prayer during Lent. And prayer is certainly a significant way of putting ourselves in God's or the divine presence, where we can become something even more beautiful than who we are right now. The Gathering contributor Kim Vidal of Nepean, Ontario, suggests that with Jesus as an example, it becomes clear that we too are meant to be transfigured. We are to be transfigured as his followers of all times and places. We too are to shine with Jesus' presence in our lives, wearing robes of love and compassion, garments of justice and peace. Moments of transfiguration change us, sustain us, prepare us, encourage us, and guide us into the future, regardless of the circumstances we face. They show us who we are, the transfigured people of God. So it is my prayer that each of us in the Lenten days ahead spend time in God's presence, opening ourselves to that divine that will transfigure us and make us reflect the divine love and beauty that has been infused within us, to be reflected in all that we say and do, so that ultimately others will know of God's great love and compassion for each of us, and indeed for the world. Marked by God's love, each of us is transfigured into something more beautiful. May it be so. Hallelujah. Amen.